Her head rested against my shoulder for 47 minutes. I kept track of every single one. She carried the scent of coffee, chilly rain, and some gentle fragrance I couldn't quite put my finger on. Her breathing stayed slow and steady. Her hair brushed right up against my jawline, and I refused to budge. I didn't shift my arm an inch. I didn't risk a cough. I just sat there on that 5:48 a.m. train bound for Chicago, acting like a guy defusing a live explosive, completely frozen, holding my breath, simply because a total stranger had dozed off on me. It marked the first time another human being had physically touched me in 14 months. When the train began to decelerate for her stop, she straightened up, blinked, and stared at me as if she were slowly piecing together where she was. "Oh God," she murmured. "I am so terribly sorry. I didn't mean to." "It's all right," I told her, flashing a reassuring smile. "Don't sweat it." She gathered her tote bag, stood up, and started making her way down the aisle. Then she froze, spun around, and locked eyes straight with me. "I wasn't actually sleeping," she said, and before I could even process a single word, she hopped off the train. I remained glued to my seat, feeling the lingering warmth of her shoulder against mine, my heart racing as though I had just sprinted a mile, watching her melt into the crowd on the platform. For the first time in 14 months, a sudden thought crossed my mind. I want to see her again. That was how it all began. 7 mornings straight on the 5:48. By the time the final morning rolled around, I realized nothing about any of it had ever been a coincidence. Let me rewind a bit. My name's Cole Sullivan, and I'm 33 years old. I work the night shift as an ER nurse at a downtown Chicago hospital. My hours run from 7 p.m. to 5 a.m., after which I catch the early morning commuter train back out to the suburbs, crash during the day in a house that feels entirely too quiet, wake up, and repeat the whole cycle. The reason my house is so unbearably quiet is that my wife passed away. Her name was Abby. She was a nurse too. That's actually how we crossed paths, working the exact same hospital on the exact same floor. 14 months ago, she received a devastating diagnosis: aggressive pancreatic cancer. She was gone in 11 weeks. I'm going to state this once and then move forward, because this story isn't about dying. It's about what came afterward. Following Abby's death, I stopped sleeping at my own house. I would step off the train, push open the front door, and the sheer emptiness would hit me like a physical blow. So, I would lie awake for an hour, maybe 2, before climbing out of bed, heading back to the hospital well ahead of schedule and diving into work. I volunteered for every extra shift they offered, pushing myself until my hands trembled from caffeine overload, my eyes burned from exhaustion, and I couldn't feel a thing except the next patient, the next medical chart, the next urgent task that demanded my attention. The train served as my only sanctuary. Something about the rhythmic motion, the muffled background noise, and the comforting fact that I was surrounded by strangers who knew nothing about me, and wouldn't tilt their heads with that pitying look and ask, "How are you holding up, Cole?" offered a rare kind of solace. I rode the 5:48 every single morning, claiming the exact same spot, 3rd row from the back, right by the window. I would shut my eyes and let the rocking motion carry me away, occasionally grabbing 20 minutes of something resembling sleep. It was the only piece I had left. Before I reveal who she really was and how those 7 mornings on a commuter train shaped the rest of my life, let me say this. If you believe the right person can pull up a chair next to you during the darkest year of your existence and completely alter your course, go ahead and hit subscribe. This channel is packed with stories just like this one. Alright, back to the train. Morning number 2. She boarded at the exact same stop, right on time at 5:48, heading for the 3rd car. I spotted her instantly because my body recognized her long before my brain caught up. My shoulder felt an immediate hint of warmth. She chose a seat 3 rows ahead of me and kept her gaze fixed straight ahead, never turning back. She wore a dark braided hairstyle, a navy coat, and carried a tote bag with a book poking out the top. She spent the entire ride immersed in that book. I tried convincing myself I was relieved she hadn't chosen the seat right next to me again. I was entirely full of it. Morning number 3. She sat 1 row ahead of me this time. Still didn't look back, still glued to her pages. But as the train rattled around the sharp river curve, the one that always jolts everyone, her hand shot out toward the empty seat beside her instinctively, as if she were steadying an object or a person. When she got off at her usual stop, she cast a quick glance back toward the train and my specific window. I know she did because I was watching, and our eyes met for a split second before we both abruptly looked away at the exact same time. Morning 4. She took a seat in my very row, just on the opposite side of the aisle. She had her book cracked open, but I could tell she wasn't actually reading a word because she hadn't flipped a single page in 20 minutes. I was keeping score, which clearly meant keeping tabs on this woman had somehow become my entire personality. Suddenly, the train lurched violently. Her book slipped straight off her lap. Without thinking, I reached across the aisle and snatched it out of the air before it hit the floor. She looked at me. I looked at her. Nice reflexes, she remarked.
I'm on our nurse, I replied.
Catching things is kind of my specialty. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. What's the strangest thing you've ever caught? A guy's dentures midair right in the middle of an epileptic seizure. She let out a genuine, out-loud laugh, the kind that turns heads in a dead-silent train car. I'm Hannah, she said. Cole. She rolled my name around on her tongue as if she were savoring it. You ride this train every single morning. You do too. I've only been on it for a couple of weeks, she noted. You've been riding it much longer. I can tell. You've got an assigned seat. People who secure a seat have been doing this for a long time. Sharp and deeply observant. I liked her right off the bat, and at the same time, I despised myself for liking her because it had only been 14 months since I buried my wife, and feeling a spark of attraction felt like the ultimate betrayal. Where are you heading off to every morning? I asked, keeping my tone casual. A flicker of hesitation crossed her face. Into the city. That narrows it down. It's supposed to. She offered a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. She disembarked at her usual stop, the exact same stop she used every single morning. Morning 5. She sat right next to me. No preamble, no asking for permission. She simply sat down, wedged her bag between her feet, opened her book, and existed right beside me as if she had been doing it for years. We stayed silent for the first 20 minutes, and it was glorious. It was that rare kind of quiet I hadn't experienced since Abby passed, where two people feel entirely comfortable letting silence linger without any awkwardness. Then, without glancing up from her pages, she spoke up. You don't sleep at home, do you? I turned my head sharply. What? You sleep on this train. I've been watching you. You bored looking like you haven't caught a wink of rest in a week. But by the time we hit the river bend, your eyes shut, your hands unclench, and you actually find some peace. She still hadn't looked my way. You don't let yourself do that at home. Something about your house refuses to let you rest. My throat tightened up instantly. You don't have to explain what it is, she added softly. I just wanted you to know that someone noticed. I kept my mouth shut that morning, but something inside me fractured. Some sturdy defensive wall I had meticulously built out of double shifts, endless coffee cups, and emotional numbness had just taken a hairline crack from a single piercing observation, and I could feel the entire structure starting to give way. Morning 6. She opened up about herself, or at least a curated version of herself. I realize now how carefully she doled out information while holding other parts back. Her name was Hannah Reed, age 31. She worked as a freelance children's book illustrator, mostly operating out of her home office. She grew up downstate in Springfield and had relocated to the suburbs about a year prior. She lived by herself. Why catch such an early train? I asked. Every single morning at 5:48. That's a brutal schedule for someone who works from home. She turned a page quietly. I'm visiting someone. Every single day. Every day? That's a lot of visiting. It's a lot of someone, she replied in a quiet tone. I didn't press further, and she didn't offer any more details. We rode the remainder of the trip in comfortable silence. As she stepped off at her stop, she brushed her fingers briefly against my arm, just two light fingers sliding across my sleeve, and said, "See you tomorrow, Cole." Just two fingers on my sleeve, yet I felt the ghost of that touch for the entire rest of the day. That night during my shift, I did something I'm certainly not proud of. I looked her up. Hannah Reed, illustrator. Her portfolio website popped up, featuring gorgeous watercolor artwork for children's books. The kind of soft, meticulous illustrations that force you to slow down and breathe. On her About Me page, a single dedication caught my eye. For my mother, who taught me that the best stories are the ones you tell to someone who needs to hear them. Her mother. She was visiting her mother every single day via the 548. And when I cross-referenced the address of the hospital where the train dropped her off, my stomach dropped. It was my hospital, my workplace. I walked down to the central patient directory and typed in the name. Reed, Margaret Reed, room 614, oncology. The air vanished from my lungs. Her mother was dying in my hospital, housed on a floor I walked past every single night. I stood alone in that sterile hospital hallway at 3 a.m., suddenly and horribly understanding why Hannah Reed caught the 548 train every day, why she kept her destination a secret, and why she had looked at me with such knowing eyes when she mentioned that home wouldn't let me sleep. She understood. She recognized the look. That profound exhaustion and grief you wear like a winter coat you can't ever quite take off. She was watching her own heartbreak approach. Morning 7. I took the seat right beside her. I know about your mom, I said quietly. Her entire body froze. I work at that hospital, Hannah. I looked you up last night. Room 614. Oncology. I kept my voice level, though my hands were clenched tightly in my lap. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have gone snooping, but I needed to understand why you were really riding this train. She closed her book, holding it tightly in her lap with both hands until her knuckles turned stark white. How long? I asked. 3 months, maybe 4. The doctors aren't even sure anymore. Her voice came out flat and rehearsed, the practiced tone of someone who had repeated the harsh reality enough times that the words had worn as smooth as river stones. She was diagnosed a year ago down in Springfield. I moved up here to be close to the facility. I catch this train every single morning to sit by her bed from 6 o'clock until noon. Then I head home, draw pictures of talking animals, and pretend I'm not slowly losing the only person who ever. She stopped herself, swallowed hard, and started again. She's all I've got, Cole. I know what that feels like, I said softly. I know you do. She looked straight at me. That's why I sat down next to you in the first place. And here is where the entire narrative pivots. Here is the massive twist I never saw coming. Not the mother, not the hospital connection, but something entirely different. I need to tell you something, she said, her voice trembling slightly, and it might make you angry. People keep warning me that I'm going to get angry, I replied. I never am. Your wife, Hannah, she began. Abby. The ambient roar of the train seemed to vanish entirely. My mother has been in oncology for a full year, Hannah continued. She had a lot of different nurses pass through her room. Most of them were fine, professional, perfectly kind. But there was one. Her voice thickened with emotion. There was one nurse who would sit with her late at night when insomnia kept her awake, who brought her tea, who chatted with her about random things, books, old classic movies, her garden back home. This nurse treated my mother like a real human being instead of just a room number. And Mom talked about her every single day. She called her the kind one, the one who had also lost her husband. Hannah's eyes welled up with tears. Her name was Abby. I couldn't move a muscle. Abby was my mother's nurse, Hannah said. For 3 months before she got sick herself. Hannah wiped at her face. Mom broke down crying when she heard the news. She told me that this wonderful woman had a husband. A good, decent man. She talked about him constantly, saying he was the kindest, quietest man she had ever known. And she worried sick about what would happen to him once she was gone. Mom made her promise. Made her promise that if the opportunity ever arose. Hannah's voice finally broke. She said, "Look after him. He's going to try to disappear." The train swayed gently along the tracks as the city skyline rose up through the windows, though I couldn't bring myself to look at it. "I didn't plan any of this," Hannah whispered. "I didn't come hunting for you, but Mom told me your name, Cole. Night shift DR." She paused, catching her breath. "And one morning I boarded this train, and there you were, third row, window seat, completely unable to sleep. And I thought to myself, that's him. That's the guy Abby worried about." She was openly crying now, making no effort to hide it. "I told myself I would just observe. I'd make sure you were okay from a distance. I swore I wouldn't sit next to you, wouldn't speak to you. I'd just keep an eye out for Abby's sake. For Mom's sake." She looked right into my eyes. "And then I went ahead and sat next to you anyway. You caught my book. You turned out to be precisely the man she described, and I couldn't stop myself." "Morning one," I said, my voice sounding as though it belonged to a total stranger. "You fell asleep on my shoulder." "I wasn't sleeping," she corrected softly. "I told you that back then, Cole. I wasn't really sleeping. I was leaning against you on purpose because I had spent 3 weeks watching a man slowly erase himself into a window seat. And I desperately needed to find out if you still possessed any warmth, if there was still a living soul in there." She pressed her hands tightly together. "And there was. You didn't budge for 47 minutes. You let a complete stranger rest her entire weight on you without so much as flinching. And I thought to myself, Abby was right. He's still in there. He's just spent far too long all alone." I sat right there on that moving train and wept for the first time in 14 months. Not the quiet kind of crying you desperately try to hide. The deep, guttural kind that surges up from somewhere ancient and unyielding, demanding no permission. I buried my face in my hands and completely broke down right there in the third row of the 548. Hannah didn't utter a single word. She simply reached out, placed her hand firmly on my back, and left it there. She didn't try to minimize my pain or rush me through it. When I finally regained control of my voice, I said the only thing that made sense. "She sent you." "She didn't send me," Hannah corrected gently. "She just asked someone to keep an eye on you. I merely happened to be the one capable of doing it. That amounts to the exact same thing." "Perhaps," she conceded, "though I didn't fall for you simply because Abby asked my mother to look out for you. I fell for you because you snatched a falling book out of midair, shared a funny story about a man's dentures during an epileptic seizure, and sat completely immobilized for 47 minutes just so a total stranger could catch some rest." She stared at me with those dark, striking eyes, rimmed in red, yet steady and resolute. "Abby got me onto this train in the first place. You're the one who convinced me to stay. I wish I could tell you I handled the rest of that morning like a seasoned adult. I didn't. I went straight home, drew all the heavy curtains, sat in total darkness, and felt the walls closing in around me. Every single survival instinct in my body, the exact same coping mechanisms that had kept me mechanically functioning for 14 months, screamed at me to pick up an extra shift. Fill the hours. Don't sit with this pain. Don't let yourself feel it. Just run. I nearly grabbed my phone to call the hospital. I actually had the receiver in my hand. But then I heard Abby's voice echoing in my mind, just the way I used to hear it during the roughest nights. Not the sick, frail Abby, but the real one. The vibrant woman who would lean casually against the nurse's station and deliver lines disguised as casual jokes that carried the weight of profound wisdom. Cole, you can't outwork grief. You can only outwork yourself. And when you're done, the grief is still sitting right there, and you're just left bone tired. I set the phone down on the table. I stayed right there in my chair. I didn't catch a wink of sleep, but I stayed put. The next morning, I boarded the 5:48. Same car, same seat. Hannah was already waiting. She didn't bring up yesterday's emotional breakdown at all. Instead, she unzipped her bag, pulled out 2 cardboard coffee cups, one black, one loaded with cream, and extended the black one toward me. How did you know I take it black? I asked, raising an eyebrow. You're a night shift ER nurse, she replied smoothly. Nobody working those kinds of hours ruins good coffee with cream. I took the cup from her hand. We rode in peaceful silence, and somewhere past the river bend, her hand found mine resting on the armrest between us. She laced her fingers loosely and carefully with mine, as if silently asking for permission with the heavy weight of her touch. I didn't pull away. We never explicitly discussed it after that morning, but from then on, that middle armrest belonged to both of us. The first time we ventured outside the routine of the train was technically an accident, or at least that's what Hannah claimed. I personally believe roughly 0% of anything Hannah Reid ever labeled an accident. She was waiting for me on the platform one Saturday morning. A weekend, meaning no hospital shifts for me and no visiting hours yet for her. She had a sketch pad tucked under her arm and a paper bag overflowing with fresh pastries from the bakery down on Main Street. When she spotted me stepping off, she feigned surprise. Oh, fancy seeing you here. I was actually planning to sketch the river from the bridge. You're welcome to tag along if you want. I brought extra croissants. Is this officially a date? I asked. It's just a pastry, Cole. Stop overthinking everything. So we strolled over to the bridge together. She hopped up and sat cross-legged right on the high stone railing. That looks terrifying, I noted. She deliberately ignored me, pulled out her pencils and started drawing, while I planted myself on a nearby bench below her, biting into a croissant that was still warm from the oven and watching the river flow lazily beneath us. After a quiet moment, without lifting her gaze from her sketch pad, she asked, "Can I draw you? I hardly think I'm a very interesting subject to draw." You're dead wrong about that. She flipped to a fresh page. You've got nurse's hands. They're constantly in motion. Even when you're sitting totally still, your fingers are doing something. Checking, adjusting, reaching out. It's like they literally don't know how to stop working. Abby used to say the exact same thing. It marked the first time I had spoken my late wife's name aloud to Hannah. The first time saying it didn't feel like swallowing crushed glass. Hannah's pencil paused for a single beat before resuming its rhythmic scratching against the paper. Tell me about her hands, Hannah murmured. And I did. Right there on a windy bridge on a Saturday morning, sharing a pastry, I opened up. I told her all about Abby's hands. How she could effortlessly start in 4 in pitch-dark conditions. How she used her short breaks to knit that famous blue scarf currently tucked away in my dresser drawer. how she would cup my face in her palms whenever she wanted to make sure I was really listening to her, and how her skin had still felt miraculously warm the very last time I held her. Hannah sketched the entire time. She never once looked up, simply letting me talk the way a seasoned medic lets someone bleed out. Not trying to stem the flow, just expertly catching it. When I finally ran out of words, she spun the sketch pad around to face me. She had drawn my hands, just my hands, resting naturally against my knees, fingers slightly curled. It was the most brutally honest and beautiful portrait anyone had ever captured of me. "Keep it," she said softly. "I still have it today. It hangs proudly on the wall right above my nightstand. A matching set of sides for the bed now, her published books resting on one nightstand, that detailed pencil drawing mounted on my wall, and Abby's blue scarf neatly folded in the drawer directly below. Everything finally in its proper place. I eventually started visiting room 614 outside of my scheduled work shifts. Once my morning shift wrapped up at 5 a.m., I'd ride the elevator straight up to oncology and sit with Margaret Reed, while Hannah was still commuting in on the train. Margaret possessed a sharp, witty humor that was slowly fading as her body weakened, yet she retained her fierce intellect right to the end. The very first morning I walked through her door, she peered at me over her reading glasses and announced, "So, you must be Abby's Cole." "I'm Cole," I replied, taking a seat. "Sit down," she commanded playfully. "She talked about you constantly, you know. Your late wife told me all about how you'd never ask for help, how you'd stubbornly work yourself straight into an early grave, and how someone needed to step in and watch out for you." She adjusted her glasses on her nose. "I always told my daughter, Hannah is far too stubborn for her own good. Once she gets assigned a task, God help whatever poor soul is on the receiving end. Well, she literally ambushed me by falling asleep on a commuter train," I pointed out. "Of course she did," Margaret chuckled. "That girl has never once done a single thing the conventional way in her entire life." I spent 3 mornings a week keeping Margaret company for 2 solid months. Naturally, Hannah and I frequently overlapped. She would arrive just as I was lingering, and gradually, our visits morphed into a trio. Margaret would watch the two of us the way a dying person watches the living, with careful, hungry attentiveness, double-checking to ensure the world she was leaving behind was going to be left in capable hands. One morning, while Hannah stepped out to grab a fresh cup of coffee, Margaret suddenly reached out and grabbed my wrist with surprising strength for someone so frail. "She's fallen in love with you," Margaret whispered earnestly. "She hasn't dared say it out loud yet because she's utterly terrified of losing someone she cares about within the exact same 4 walls where she's currently losing me. She genuinely believes that if she speaks those words into existence, it will become real enough for fate to snatch away." She squeezed my wrist tighter. "Don't wait for her to break the ice. She won't do it. She's far too scared. You say it first. You're the brave one." Abby explicitly said so. Abby apparently said a lot of things. Abby said precisely the right things, Margaret corrected. To precisely the right person. She fell silent for a moment before continuing. "Shall I tell you what she actually wrote down? The exact words? Because I made sure to write them down, knowing they would matter immensely someday." She reached beneath her hospital pillow, stashing things there like a kid hiding precious contraband, and pulled out a folded piece of official hospital stationery. She read aloud in a voice that seemed a hybrid of her own and someone else's. "He's going to feel so utterly alone once I'm gone, Margaret. He refuses to ask for help. He'll just bury himself in work until there's nothing left of him, convincing himself that makes him strong. But it doesn't. It just hollows him out. If you ever get the chance, find someone to show him that the world still holds plenty of warmth. He'll fight it, he always resists, but he's worth the grueling fight. He's the kindest, quietest, most stubborn man alive, and he deserves someone who will simply sit next to him and refuse to move. That's all he really needs. Someone who doesn't budge. Margaret carefully refolded the paper and slid it back beneath her pillow. She knew, Margaret said softly. Dying people always intuitively understand what the living need most. We simply run out of time to deliver it ourselves. She locked her eyes onto mine. Now go out there and be the man she asked you to be, the kind one who refuses to disappear. Margaret passed away on a quiet Tuesday in April. Hannah held one of her hands. I held the other. Take a moment to really let that sink in. 14 months earlier, my wife had breathed her last breath in that exact same hospital. And here I stood once again, clasping another woman's hand on the opposite side of a heartbreakingly familiar goodbye. Yet this time I wasn't running away. I wasn't burying myself in double shifts. I wasn't retreating into the anonymity of a window seat. I was right there, fully present. Showing up, it turns out, is the entire game of life. Just like Cole's dad and his old hardware store, just like Abby's midnight cups of tea, and just like a woman who rode the 5:48 train every single morning to sit beside her dying mother, returning every night to sketch gentle talking animals because the world desperately needed soft things to hold on to. Hannah understandably fell apart after Margaret's passing. How could she not? The woman who had held it together for an entire year, enduring that grueling daily train commute while remaining fiercely brave, steady, and careful through every trial, finally cracked wide open. And I caught her, just the way I had caught her book before it hit the floor. I didn't try to slap a quick fix on her grief. I simply sat with her through the dark, quiet hours, on a train, on a living room couch, and directly on the floor of her apartment at 2 o'clock in the morning. I fulfilled the exact promise Abby had asked Margaret to ensure someone kept. I didn't let Cole Sullivan fade away, and in doing so, I made sure Hannah Reed didn't fade away either. We tied the knot the following autumn. It was an intimate affair held right in the hospital chapel, the same hospital where it all happened, because honestly, where else could it possibly be? My crew from the ER turned out in full force. Hannah's publisher attended. The oncology nurses who had grown close to Margaret sat proudly in the front row, openly weeping before the ceremony even commenced. Hannah wore the blue wool scarf Abby had knitted. I had discovered it tucked away in a drawer long after Abby's death. Soft blue yarn, nothing overly fancy, just the kind of comforting project a nurse works on during quiet night shifts to keep her hands occupied. I had saved it simply because I lacked the heart to throw away anything her skin had touched. When Hannah spotted it hanging over a chair on the morning of our wedding, she pressed it against her face, took a deep breath, and whispered, "It smells just like the tea she used to bring Mom." She draped it around her shoulders for the entire duration of the ceremony. We still catch the 5:48 train on occasion. Not every single morning anymore. I finally transitioned to working day shifts because I actually have a genuine reason to rush home to sleep at night. But every now and then, on the difficult days and the heavy anniversaries, we board that train together, riding into the city and back out again. Same rail car, same seats, third row, window side. And every single time, without fail, she leans her head softly against my shoulder, and I refuse to budge. About 10 minutes into the ride, she whispers those familiar words, "I'm not really sleeping." And I reply, "I know." Then we just ride on like that. Two weary souls who managed to cross paths on the worst commute of their lives, resting against each other in the early morning light. Not actually sleeping, but consciously choosing over and over again to stay precisely where they belong.